Picture this. You are hiding in the suffocating darkness of a collapsed cellar in Baghdad. It is February 1258. Above you, the greatest city in the world is being systematically dismantled. You press your hands over your ears, but you cannot block out the sound of 100,000 people screaming. The air smells of burning paper, roasting flesh, and raw copper. You peek through a crack in the masonry and look down at the mighty Tigris River. It is not flowing with water. It is running thick and black with the ink of 1,000,000 destroyed books from the Grand Library, swirling together with the bright crimson blood of the scholars who wrote them. The Mongol horde has breached the walls, and they are not here to conquer. They are here to erase. You watch as a warrior on horseback casually swings a mace, crushing the skull of a fleeing merchant without even breaking his stride. To the Mongols, you are not human beings. You are just weeds that need to be pulled from the earth. You are witnessing the end of the Islamic Golden Age, and you know with absolute certainty that you will not survive the night. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer, paralyzing terror of the year 1260, you have to understand that the Mongol Empire was not viewed as a normal political entity. They were viewed as a biological extinction event. When we think of empires today, we think of borders, taxes, and treaties. The Mongols operated on a different frequency. Led by Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, this war machine did not negotiate. Their diplomacy consisted of a simple, terrifying ultimatum: submit immediately and pay tribute, or every living thing in your city down to the dogs and cats will be slaughtered. And they kept their promises. When Baghdad, the crown jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate and the center of global intellect, dared to resist, the Mongols unleashed a level of mechanized brutality that shattered the mind of the medieval world. They wrapped the caliph in a rug and trampled him to death with horses because their superstitions forbade them from spilling royal blood on the earth. They built pyramids out of severed heads to serve as mile markers of their dominance. It is estimated that up to 1,000,000 people were butchered in a matter of weeks. The psychological impact was so profound that across Europe and the Middle East, kings and peasants alike genuinely believed the Mongols were the biblical hordes of Gog and Magog, unleashed by God to initiate the end of the world. The Mongol army was a flawless engine of mobility and mass death. Every soldier was practically born in the saddle, capable of sleeping, eating, and firing a composite bow with lethal accuracy while riding at a full gallop. They did not need supply lines. They drank the blood of their own horses to survive long marches. They weaponized terror, driving refugees ahead of their advancing armies to starve out the next target. By the time they finished turning Baghdad into a graveyard, the entire Middle East was paralyzed. The dominoes were falling rapidly. Syria collapsed next. Aleppo and Damascus were reduced to ash and rubble. The Mongol vanguard, commanded by the ruthless General Kitbuka, was now staring down the coastline toward Africa. Only one obstacle remained, standing between the invincible horde and the total annihilation of the Islamic world. That obstacle was Egypt. But Egypt was not ruled by a traditional royal bloodline. It was ruled by a caste of former slaves, a group of men who knew a thing or two about surviving the meat grinder. You have to understand that the Mongol Empire did not operate like a normal nation-state. It operated like a biological meat grinder, a ruthless extinction event that crushed everything in its path. When other medieval armies marched, They brought logistical wagons, carpenters, and slow-moving carts groaning under the weight of grain. The Mongols did not. They brought lean, calloused war horses and an eternal hunger. If there was no water on the steppe, a Mongol warrior would simply slice a vein on his own horse's neck, drink a few mouthfuls of hot blood to survive the death march, patch the wound, and keep riding. They did not deploy to conquer, they deployed to erase. By 1260, the psychological warfare of the Mongol Empire had essentially broken the mind of the known world. They perfected a strategy of weaponized terror that made actual combat almost unnecessary. Their reputation arrived like a toxic gas, suffocating the will to fight long before the first arrow was drawn. Their rules of invasion were brutally simple. If a city surrendered immediately, the inhabitants might be spared, heavily taxed, and swallowed into the machine. But if a city dared to close its gates, if a single arrow was fired in defiance, the entire population was condemned to death. Every man, woman, child, dog, and cat was systematically slaughtered. They did not do this out of blind rage. They did it with the cold, calculated efficiency of an accountant balancing a ledger. They used the corpses of their victims as psychological weapons. When besieging a stubborn fortress, they did not waste their own soldiers on the front lines. They herded peasants from the surrounding villages, the very people the fortress was supposed to protect, and forced them forward as human shields. They made the defenders exhaust their arrows and boiling oil on their own families. It was a level of psychological torture so profound that many cities simply threw open their gates and waited for the sword. The Mongols did not just defeat armies, they dismantled the human soul. That is why European kings and Middle Eastern sultans did not view the Mongols as a hostile military force. They viewed them as an actual punishment from God. Priests and clerics alike preached that the sins of mankind had finally unleashed the apocalypse. When the Mongols erased the Khwarezmian Empire, they diverted massive rivers to wash away the ruins of cities, ensuring no one could ever rebuild on that cursed soil. They poured molten silver into the eyes and ears of greedy governors. They turned the skulls of rival kings into silver-lined drinking cups. They didn't just kill you, they turned your destruction into macabre performance art. And now, this invincible, cannibalistic war machine is sitting on the edge of the Sinai Peninsula. The great General Kitbuka, a hardened veteran who has spent his entire life turning prosperous nations into mass graves, is looking across the desert toward Cairo. The Islamic world is bleeding to death. Its greatest cities are smoking craters. The scholars are dead, the libraries are ash, and the leaders are paralyzed by an apocalyptic dread. But the Mongols are about to make a fatal miscalculation. They assume that anyone will break when subjected to enough horror. They assume that fear is a universal language. What they do not realize is that the men waiting for them in Egypt have already survived hell. The Mongols are used to fighting kings who inherited their crowns and peasants who are terrified of dying. They have never faced an army of men born in chains, stripped of everything, and recast in the fires of perpetual violence. The Mongols are preparing to ride into the desert expecting another effortless slaughter. Instead, they are about to step right into a mirror. Forget the fairy tales about noble knights fighting for honor, religion, and royal bloodlines. The final defenders of the Islamic world were not born in magnificent marble palaces or glowing estates. They were born on the dusty steppes, kidnapped from their parents' arms as 8- or 9-year-old boys, and sold like raw meat at filthy slave markets across the Middle East. They were called Mamluks, an Arabic word that literally translates to owned property. But these properties were not purchased to sweep floors or pour wine, they were purchased to kill. The Mamluk military machine was one of the most ruthless, bloody, and efficient projects of social engineering in human history. When a boy was thrown into the barracks, everything that made him human was systematically burned away. His old name, his mother tongue, his family, his religion, his childhood memories, all erased. He was given a new name, converted to Islam, and forced into a military training regimen so brutal that weakness was rewarded with a quiet death. They were forged into perfect engines of war. A Mamluk cadet had to learn how to ride a horse at a full gallop without using the reins, steering the beast with his knees while continuously firing arrows with lethal precision into targets the size of a melon. They had to swing heavy iron swords until their hands bled and scabbed over into thick layers of callus. They didn't just learn to use weapons, they learned to become one with them, turning violence into an unconditional reflex. Through this slaughterhouse of an education, a strange and dangerous psychology was born. Cut off from all biological ties, these slave boys viewed the other recruits in their barracks as their only family, and the master who bought them as their only father. Their loyalty was not to a nation, a border, or an abstract ideology. Their loyalty was a bloody survival network forged in the dirt of the training grounds. This created an elite heavy cavalry force so tightly bound that no mercenary army or conscripted militia could ever match them. They were a pack of armored wolves, ready to tear apart anyone who threatened the den. But the sultans of Egypt underestimated a fundamental law of nature. If you breed a pack of wolves to rip apart your enemies, you can never, ever show weakness. By the mid-13th century, these guard dogs realized they had much sharper teeth than the masters holding the leashes. In a series of violently uncompromising coups, the Mamluks slaughtered the old elite, tore the Egyptian throne from their hands, and installed themselves as the rulers. Their hierarchy was beautifully simple and utterly ruthless. The strongest, the most cunning, and the most capable of surviving an assassination attempt became the Sultan. Power was not handed down peacefully from father to son. Power was measured by the pile of skulls you could stack beneath the throne. And now look at the perfect, twisted irony of history. The Mongol horde currently incinerating the world is made up of steppe nomads, the undisputed masters of horseback warfare. And the only force left to stop them, the Mamluks of Egypt, also carry the blood of the steppes in their veins. Most Mamluks were Turkic or Circassian, born on the exact same unforgiving plains that birthed the Mongols. The coming war is not a clash between two alien worlds. It is a war between the wild monsters of the plains and the monsters who were militarized, armored, and perfected in the killing laboratories of Egypt. Sultan Qutuz, the current leader of the Mamluks, was himself a former slave boy, sold at auction, a man who intimately knew the taste of the whip and the weight of the chains. He knows exactly who the Mongols are. He knows they cannot be bought with gold, and they cannot be appeased with soft diplomacy. So when Hulagu Khan's envoys ride to the gates of Cairo carrying a blood-soaked ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender, Qutuz does not flinch. He doesn't see the end of the world approaching. He just sees another apex predator daring to step onto his turf. And in the ruthless world of the Mamluks, there is only one way to answer a threat. The massive wooden doors of the citadel in Cairo swing open, and the silence that follows is suffocating. 4 men stride into the great hall, their heavy boots echoing off the polished stone. They are not diplomats in any traditional sense. They are the heralds of the apocalypse. The Mongol envoys have arrived, and they carry a piece of parchment that has already doomed a dozen empires. Sitting on the throne is Sultan Qutuz. He does not wear the terrified, pleading expression the Mongols are so accustomed to seeing on the faces of royalty. He sits with the terrifying stillness of a predator, waiting for its prey to step into range. The lead envoy unrolls the letter from Hulagu Khan, the architect of the Baghdad massacre. The words are not a negotiation, they are a psychological weapon, surgically crafted to break the human spirit before a single sword is drawn. The letter is a masterpiece of historical arrogance. It reads, "From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, to Qutuz the Mamluk who fled to escape our swords. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains." The envoy finishes reading and rolls up the parchment, a smug, contemptuous smirk likely playing on his lips. He expects the Sultan to weep. He expects chests of gold to be dragged into the room as a pathetic offering of appeasement. But Hulagu Khan has made a critical miscalculation. He addressed Qutuz as a coward who fled. He tried to intimidate a man who had been sold at a filthy slave auction, beaten, starved, and trained to kill without remorse since childhood. You cannot threaten a Mamluk with death. Death is the currency they have dealt in every single day of their lives. Qutuz does not panic. He doesn't summon his advisors to debate the geopolitical ramifications of his next move. He simply looks at the envoys, looks at his armored guards, and gives a slight silent nod. In an instant, the sacred diplomatic immunity of the medieval world is shattered into 1,000 pieces. Mamluk executioners step forward, their heavy curved blades catching the sunlight. There is no grand speech, there is no trial, there is only the sickening crunch of steel slicing violently through bone and cartilage. In a matter of seconds, the 4 arrogant heralds of the Mongol Empire are decapitated right there on the throne room floor. Their hot blood pools over the expensive Persian rugs, a stark, brilliant red against the woven wool. But Qutuz isn't finished. Killing the envoys is an act of war, but what he does next is an act of psychological warfare designed to mirror the Mongols' own brutal tactics. He orders the severed heads of the emissaries to be dragged through the dusty streets of Cairo and spiked high upon the Bab Zuela, the massive fortified stone gate of the city. He wants every citizen, every soldier, and every trembling foreign spy to look up and see the lifeless, rotting faces of the invincible horde. It is a declaration of war written in flesh and bone. The message is undeniable. The Mongol meat grinder stops here. This act of supreme, suicidal defiance sends shockwaves through the Mamluk ranks. Panic instantly sets in among some of the high-ranking emirs. They know that no one does this to the Mongols and lives to tell the tale. When Qutuz calls an emergency council of war, several of his battle-hardened commanders urge him to flee, to abandon Egypt and hide in the deep deserts of North Africa. The terror of the horde still hangs like a heavy, suffocating blanket over their minds, but Qutuz slams his armored fist on the table, instantly silencing the room. He glares at his generals, men who have survived the exact same brutal upbringing he did, and he shames them to their core. He declares, "O princes of the Muslims, for a time you have been eating the wealth of the country, and now you are reluctant to fight. I will go to battle myself. Whoever chooses to fight, let him accompany me. Whoever does not, let him return to his house. But the sin of abandoning the women and children to the Mongols will be on the necks of those who stay behind." It is a master stroke of psychological manipulation. He appeals to their toxic pride, their machismo, and their fierce sense of brotherhood. Even Baybars, a brilliant and notoriously ruthless Mamluk commander who absolutely hates Qutuz and recently tried to assassinate him, steps forward and pledges his sword. The internal blood feuds are temporarily paused. The Mamluk war machine, an engine of violence just as terrifying and efficient as the Mongols, is finally awake and hungry. The clash of the ultimate apex predators is set. It is September 3rd, 1260. The sun beating down on the Jezreel Valley is absolutely merciless. The air is thick, choked with the blinding white dust kicked up by tens of thousands of war horses. This is Ain Jalut, a name that translates to the spring of Goliath. According to biblical legend, it is the exact spot where a young David slaughtered the giant with a single stone. But as the morning heat rises, there are no righteous shepherds here. There are only two massive, mechanized engines of death marching toward a collision that will decide the fate of the human race. Sultan Qutuz has not marched his Mamluk army out here blindly. He knows exactly what he is doing. He understands a fundamental law of military physics that every other dead king in the Middle East completely failed to grasp. You cannot fight the Mongol horde on an open plain. The Mongols operate like a fluid. Give them an open horizon and their light cavalry will simply flow around your flanks, encircle your army and shoot you to pieces from a safe distance until nothing is left but a field of pincushions. To defeat a fluid, you cannot be a rock. You have to build a pipe. You have to force that violent, swirling water exactly where you want it to go. The geography of Ain Jalut is not just a battlefield, it is a topographical kill-box. The valley floor is relatively flat, but it is squeezed tightly between the jagged, unforgiving slopes of Mount Gilboa to the south and the hills of Galilee to the north. It forms a natural funnel. Qutuz looks at this funnel and sees the perfect slaughterhouse. He is about to strip the Mongols of the one advantage that makes them invincible, their infinite mobility. He is going to pack them into a space so tight they will choke on their own numbers. But a trap only works if the animal steps into it. Under the cover of darkness, Qutuz orders the vast majority of his heavy Mamluk cavalry, thousands of terrifyingly disciplined, heavily armored killers, to move up into the densely wooded highlands surrounding the valley. They are ordered to dismount and wait in the suffocating shadows of the trees. The discipline required for this is staggering. Thousands of men and horses stand in absolute silence, sweating under the weight of chainmail and iron helmets. Men wrap cloth around their horses' snouts to prevent them from whinnying. They grip the hilts of their swords until their knuckles turn white. The tension is a physical weight pressing down on their chests. One panicked horse, one dropped shield, and the ambush is ruined. Down on the valley floor, baking in the open sun, Qutuz places his bait. He leaves a small vanguard force commanded by his bitter rival, Baybars. Baybars and his men are highly visible. They make noise. They raise their banners high, letting the wind catch the bright silks. They look exactly like a desperate, terrified army making a foolish last stand. And then the horizon turns black. The ground begins to vibrate with a low, sickening rumble that rattles the teeth in your skull. The Mongol horde, led by the undefeated General Kitbuka, pours into the mouth of the valley. Kitbuka looks across the shimmering heat waves and sees Baybars' small force. He doesn't see a trap. He sees an appetizer. Why would he look for an ambush? The Mongols do not get ambushed. They do the ambushing. For decades, Kitbuka has watched massive, professional armies dissolve into weeping mobs at the mere sight of his horse archers. He has piled the skulls of kings into mountains. He genuinely believes that these former slaves are just another pathetic obstacle waiting to be ground into fertilizer. The arrogance of the Mongol Empire has calcified into blindness. Kitbuka does not pause to read the terrain. He does not send out scouts to check the dense, unnaturally quiet tree line of Mount Gilboa. He simply draws his blade, sounds the massive war drums that echo off the canyon walls like thunder, and orders a full frontal assault. 10,000 of the deadliest horsemen on earth accelerate into a dead sprint. They raise their bows, screaming their terrifying war cries, funneling themselves perfectly, willingly, and violently right into the throat of the valley. The trap is baited. The monster has entered the cage, and the butcher of Baghdad has no idea he is already a dead man. You have to understand that pulling off a feigned retreat is the single most difficult, dangerous maneuver in the history of warfare. It is a psychological tightrope walked over a canyon of pure disaster. If you fake the panic poorly, the enemy sees right through the illusion and refuses to break their defensive line. But if you fake it too well, the contagious disease of fear infects your own ranks, the line shatters, and your fake retreat becomes a very real, very bloody massacre. To make the bait irresistible to a commander as ruthless and experienced as Qutuz, the Mamluk vanguard cannot just run away. They have to stay and bleed. They have to die in numbers large enough to convince the Mongols that they are genuinely breaking under the pressure. Baybars, commanding the vanguard, orders his men to hold the line as the Mongol horde accelerates toward them. The sky darkens as a terrifying cloud of armor-piercing arrows blocks out the sun. The impact is catastrophic. Mamluk horses scream as they are pinned to the earth. Men are ripped from their saddles, their chainmail punched through by the relentless kinetic energy of the Mongol archers. The air instantly fills with the foul, metallic stench of opened veins and the blinding, choking dust kicked up by thousands of hooves. Baybars forces his men to engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat, letting the casualties mount, letting the desperation look absolute. He is feeding his own soldiers into the meat grinder to buy credibility for the trap. And then, at the exact perfect second, before his men are completely annihilated, Baybars gives the signal. The Mamluks break. They drop their heavy lances, whip their horses, and turn their backs on the enemy, fleeing deeper into the Jezreel Valley. For the Mongols, this is the exact script they have followed for 3 generations. This is the muscle memory of the apocalypse. When the enemy breaks, you do not regroup. You do not hold the line. You drop the bow, you draw the sword, and you become the wolf running down the exhausted, terrified sheep. The Mongols lose all tactical cohesion. They accelerate into a chaotic, foaming mass of bloodlust, eager to hack down the fleeing cowards from behind. Qutuz, the butcher of a dozen kingdoms, is riding at the front, completely consumed by the intoxicating rush of another effortless slaughter. He pushes his army faster, deeper, into the narrow, suffocating throat of Ain Jalut. They are moving so fast, so blinded by their own arrogance, that they do not notice the geography turning against them. The valley walls of Mount Gilboa and the Galilean hills are closing in. The vast, open plain where the Mongols are invincible is suddenly gone. They are packing themselves into a tight, fatal corridor. Their horses are bumping into each other. The fluid, unstoppable swarm is compressing into a dense, clumsy mass of flesh and bone. Suddenly, the fleeing Mamluk vanguard does the impossible. They do not scatter into the desert. They stop. In perfect, terrifying unison, thousands of Mamluk horsemen yank their reins, spin their mounts around, and lock their shields. The panic vanishes from their posture in an instant. They become a wall of iron. Before Qutuz can even process this unnatural display of discipline, the silence of the surrounding mountains is shattered. Massive war drums begin to pound from the dense tree lines above, a slow, rhythmic booming that vibrates right through the armor of the Mongol cavalry. Sultan Qutuz gives the order. 10,000 heavy Mamluk cavalrymen, men who have been waiting in the suffocating shadows for hours, explode from the tree line. They pour down the slopes like an avalanche of steel, crashing violently into the exposed flanks of the overextended Mongol column. The trap snaps shut. The ultimate hunters of the medieval world are suddenly trapped in a cage of their own making, realizing too late that the tactic they invented on the steppes of Asia is about to be used to dig their mass grave. Even caught in a topographical killbox, the Mongol horde does not simply surrender. You have to remember these men are apex predators. When the Mamluk heavy cavalry crashes into their flanks, the Mongols do not break and run. They cannot. Instead, Kitbuka rallies his trapped men with the sheer, terrifying force of his will. The Mongol horsemen, completely surrounded and packed shoulder to shoulder, draw their curved blades and fight with the ferocity of cornered wolves. The sheer density of the melee is horrific. Armor crumples under maces, horses scream as they are gutted, and the Mamluk line actually begins to buckle. Even with the element of surprise, the physical reality of fighting 10,000 Mongols face to face is a nightmare. Qutuz watches from the high ground as his perfect ambush threatens to turn into a mutual suicide pact. The Mongols are adapting. They are stabilizing. Qutuz needs a miracle. He needs to break the mind of the Mongol army before they chew through his ranks. So he gives the signal for a technology that will change the trajectory of human violence forever. From the ranks of the Mamluk infantry, specialized soldiers step forward. They are not carrying bows and they are not carrying spears. They are holding heavy, primitive iron tubes packed tightly with a volatile black powder that the Mamluks learned to synthesize and weaponize. They call it the midfa. It is the grandfather of the modern hand cannon, the very first portable firearm ever deployed on a battlefield in the Middle East. The soldiers point these iron tubes directly at the swirling, chaotic mass of the Mongol cavalry and ignite the fuses. If you are picturing the clean, precise crack of a modern rifle, erase that from your mind. The discharge of a midfa is an apocalyptic event. The weapons violently erupt with a blinding flash of orange fire, belching out massive, suffocating clouds of thick, sulphurous black smoke. The sound is not a pop. It is a deafening, chest-rattling boom that physically echoes off the steep, rocky walls of Mount Gilboa, amplifying the shockwave tenfold. The Mamluks are firing small arrows and jagged shrapnel from these tubes, but the kinetic damage is completely irrelevant. They are not trying to shoot the Mongol warriors, they are trying to traumatize their horses. The Mongol warhorse is the undisputed engine of their global empire. These animals are fearless, conditioned from birth to ignore the screams of dying men, the whistle of incoming arrows, and the deafening clash of steel. But they are still animals. They are hardwired by millions of years of evolution to flee from fire and thunder. And they have never, in their entire existence, experienced thunder that erupts horizontally from the hands of human beings. The psychological impact is instantaneous and catastrophic. The sensory overload of the blinding muzzle flashes, the choking sulfuric smoke that burns the lungs, and the unnatural echoing roars shatter the horse's discipline. The animals completely lose their minds. They rear up, wildly, violently throwing their elite riders into the bloody mud. They stampede backward into their own ranks, crushing the skulls and ribs of fallen Mongol warriors under their iron-shod hooves. The fluid, hyper-coordinated hive mind of the Mongol cavalry, the very thing that made them an invincible force of nature, evaporates in 3 seconds of pure, animalistic panic. Kitbuka watches in absolute horror as his flawless war machine dismantles itself from the inside out. He screams orders, striking his own panicked men with his sword to restore order, but his voice is completely drowned out by the agonizing shrieks of thousands of terrified horses and the relentless, booming thunder of the Mamluk hand cannons. The Mamluks have done the impossible. They have taken the Mongols' greatest weapon, their peerless mastery of mobility and cavalry, and turned it into a fatal liability. As the Mongol formation collapses into a writhing, helpless mob of trampled flesh and deafened animals, the heavily armored Mamluk knights lower their lances, spur their massive chargers forward, and ride down into the suffocating black smoke to begin the butchery. The thick, sulphurous smoke from the hand cannons is still clinging to the valley floor like a dirty shroud when the Mamluk heavy cavalry finally connects with the Mongol line. It is no longer a battle, it is an industrial-scale slaughter. The Mongols, completely stripped of their momentum, their warhorses dead, deafened, or stampeding into the distance, are forced to do the one thing they despise: fight on foot in a confined space. For the first time in their entire lives, the ultimate hunters of the medieval world are locked inside the cage. The kinetic energy of the Mamluk charge is devastating. Heavily armored knights, men who have spent their entire lives training for this exact second, plow through the chaotic, disoriented Mongol ranks. Mamluk maces crush leather helmets with the sickening wet sound of splitting melons. Long, curved swords find the narrow gaps in Mongol silk armor, opening throats and spilling hot, dark blood into the baked earth of the Jezreel Valley. The Mongols are tough, they are fearless, but in a stationary hand-to-hand meat grinder, their light bows and skirmish tactics are utterly useless against a wall of disciplined, moving iron. The myth of their invincibility is physically evaporating with every severed limb and shattered skull. At the dead center of this collapsing universe is Kitbuka. The Mongol general is a man who has burned continents, a veteran who has watched the greatest cities on earth reduced to ash. His horse has been slaughtered out from under him, but he absolutely refuses to run. He does not cower behind his dying men. He stands knee-deep in the bloody mud, his armor dented and failing, his sword soaked in the blood of former slaves. He is swinging with the mechanical, terrifying fury of a dying apex predator. When his surviving lieutenants frantically beg him to retreat, to mount a spare horse, and flee toward Syria to warn the rest of the horde, Kitbuka just spits blood and laughs in their faces. He knows the brutal mathematics of the Mongol Empire. If he runs, the great Khan will execute him anyway, for the ultimate shame of losing to a band of escaped property. He chooses to die exactly as he lived, making people bleed, but sheer, stubborn willpower cannot stop a tidal wave of steel. The Mamluks swarm him. Kitbuka is finally overwhelmed, disarmed, and dragged by his hair, bleeding, bruised, and exhausted, right to the feet of Sultan Qutuz. The two architects of this nightmare lock eyes amidst the deafening roar of the dying. Even on his knees, bound and surrounded by the mutilated corpses of his once invincible army, Kitbuka's arrogance remains absolute. He doesn't beg. He sneers up at Qutuz, his teeth stained red, and promises that when the great Khan hears of this insult, the earth itself will shake. He promises that the Mongol retaliation will erase the Mamluks from the face of history, down to their very last child. Qutuz does not indulge in a dramatic, villainous monologue. He does not debate theology or politics with a dead man. He simply looks down at the butcher of Baghdad, draws his heavy blade, and takes off Kitbuka's head with a single, brutal, unceremonious swing. The severed head of the most feared general in the Middle East hits the bloody dirt with a dull thud, his lifeless eyes staring blankly up at the unforgiving desert sun. In that exact violent fraction of a second, the trajectory of human history fractures. The psychological spell that has paralyzed the civilized world for over half a century is permanently broken. The Mongols are not invincible demons. They are not a biblical plague sent by a furious god to initiate the apocalypse. They are just flesh and bone. They bleed red, they panic when they are trapped, and their heads separate from their necks just as easily as anyone else's. By sunset, the Valley of Goliath is choked with the bodies of 10,000 Mongol warriors. The invincible horde has been completely, utterly annihilated. When the blinding dust and suffocating gunpowder smoke at the Valley of Ain Jalut finally cleared, revealing tens of thousands of rotting Mongol corpses baking under the desert sun, you might expect the heroic music to swell. You might imagine the armored Mamluk knights wiping the blood from their swords, riding home into a glorious sunset, and ruling the land as benevolent, enlightened kings. But history is not a family-friendly Hollywood movie. History is bloody, ruthless, and bitterly ironic. The truth is, you cannot take boys out of a psychological slaughterhouse, forge them into emotionless killing machines for 2 decades, and then expect them to suddenly understand the value of peace or compassion. Almost immediately after the greatest victory in human history, a victory that saved Islamic civilization and potentially Europe from total extinction, the bloody fractures within the Mamluk ranks violently split open. Sultan Qutuz, the great savior who had just personally decapitated the Mongol general, did not even live long enough to enjoy a victory parade in his own capital. On the exhausting march back to Cairo, right in the middle of the unforgiving Egyptian desert, a trap was sprung. When Qutuz separated from the main column to go hunting, his own brother-in-arms, vanguard commander Baybars, made his move. There was no honorable duel, there was no grand speech. Baybars and his co-conspirators simply drove their heavy blades right into the back of the man who had just saved the world. Baybars did not do this for some high-minded political ideal or deep philosophical vision. He did it because Qutuz had previously promised to give him the governorship of Syria and then broke that promise. In the cutthroat survival of the fittest world of these former slave soldiers, a broken promise is paid for with the blood from a slit throat. Mamluk loyalty only remained absolute as long as there was a mutual enemy to butcher. The second there were no more Mongol monsters to kill, the wolves immediately turned their fangs on each other. Qutuz's bleeding corpse was left to rot in the sand, and Baybars rode back to Cairo, installing himself as the new sultan through the exact same primal violence that had kept him alive since childhood. The Mamluk Empire, solidified by Baybars, would go on to rule Egypt and Syria for nearly 3 centuries, and they established the most terrifying paradox of power the Middle East had ever seen. On one hand, they were the ultimate protectors. They built magnificent mosques, massive hospitals, and incredible schools, restoring the glowing prosperity of a civilization that had almost been crushed to ash by Mongol hooves. But on the other hand, they did all of this with an iron fist soaked in blood that never truly washed clean. You have to remember the Mamluks did not even speak the same language as the people they ruled. They were Turkic and Circassian warriors dominating native Arabs. They operated as a completely alien, closed-loop military elite. To them, the local farmers and merchants were not fellow citizens. They were sheep to be sheared. The Mamluk dynasty squeezed the civilian population dry with crushing taxes to fund their massive war machine. They extinguished even the slightest hint of rebellion with extreme theatrical violence, and most darkly, they continued to maintain and expand the exact same brutal slave trade system that had created them, purchasing tens of thousands of new boys from the steppes to throw into the training camps, ensuring the meat grinder never ran out of fresh flesh. This is the darkest lesson that the Battle of Ain Jalut violently throws in our faces. Sometimes civilization is not saved by the good guys, the moral scholars, or the righteous saints. Sometimes it is only saved by armored psychopaths who just happen to hate your enemies slightly more than they hate you. The Mamluks proved that extreme violence, when applied with absolute precision and discipline, can bend the trajectory of human history. but they also served as living proof of another unbreakable law. Violence breeds violence. The swords that shattered the Mongol horde were never truly put away. They were simply turned around and pointed directly at the throats of the very people they were supposed to protect. Look at a map of the world in the year 1260. The Mongol Empire stretches like a massive, suffocating bloodstain from the shores of the Pacific Ocean all the way to the borders of Poland. It is the largest contiguous land empire in human history, built on a foundation of crushed skulls and burned libraries. Now put your finger on a tiny, almost invisible speck in the Levant called Ain Jalut. That tiny speck is where the unstoppable force finally slammed into the immovable object. When the news of the Mongol annihilation reached Europe and the rest of the Islamic world, people literally refused to believe it. It was like waking up one morning and being told that a group of armed orphans had just assassinated the concept of death itself. But it was real, and the butterfly effect of that single afternoon in the Jezreel Valley fundamentally rewired the future of the human race. If the Mamluks had broken, if they had fled from the thunder of their own hand cannons, the gates to Africa would have been kicked wide open. Egypt, the last great bastion of Islamic scholarship, wealth, and military power, would have been reduced to a smoking crater. The Mongols would have marched across North Africa, potentially crossing the Strait of Gibraltar to hit Europe from the south, while the Golden Horde crushed it from the east. The Renaissance, the age of discovery, the world as you know it right now, simply would not exist. We would be living in a timeline dictated by the horsemen of the steppes. The Battle of Ain Jalut proved a terrifying mathematical equation to the rest of the world. The Mongols could bleed. And once the psychological spell of their invincibility was broken, the empire began to fracture. Hulagu Khan, the butcher of Baghdad, was never able to avenge his beloved general Kitbuka. He found himself locked in a bitter, catastrophic civil war with another Mongol faction, the Golden Horde, whose leader had converted to Islam and was absolutely enraged by the destruction of the caliphate. The Mongols turned their apocalyptic war machine against themselves, and the relentless expansion of their empire permanently ground to a halt. But as you look back at the Mamluks, do not make the mistake of calling them heroes. That is a word invented by poets, and poets do not survive the meat grinder. The Mamluks were the apex predators of their era, a brutal caste of slave soldiers who saved a civilization only so they could dominate it for themselves. They protected the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. They patronized magnificent architecture and art, but they funded it all by ruling their subjects with the exact same merciless, iron-fisted cruelty that they had learned in the slave camps. History is not a fairy tale, it is a slaughterhouse. And the brutal truth of Ain Jalut is that sometimes the only way to stop a monster from burning down your world is to build a bigger, meaner monster and let it off the leash. The civilized world was not saved by philosophy, diplomacy, or prayer. It was saved by a band of traumatized, heavily armored orphans who looked the devil in the eye and blew his head off with a hand cannon. If you've stuck with me to the end of this journey, you are clearly someone who values the gritty, uncomfortable, and unfiltered truths of our past. If this story of the Mamluks resonated with you, please hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a deep dive into history's darkest moments. I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you think the brutal dictatorial rule of the Mamluks was a justified price to pay for saving a civilization from total extinction, or is one tyrant just as bad as another? Let the debate begin down below. And if you want to see how another seemingly invincible empire was dismantled by sheer human willpower, click the video on your screen right now. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a warning for the future.